Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Any Landing You Can Walk Away From, Chapter 3. Jetstream trotted as quickly through the lobby of his apartment building as he could without drawing attention, the brown paper bag he'd just obtained clutched tightly in his left hoof. He hoped the medicine within would be the salvation to all him and his daughter's problems, that it would finally spell an end to this crazy weekend. Well, at least he hoped it would take away some of the intensity of the interactions with his daughter. He wouldn't mind taking her lovingly into his comfortable bed for a romantic cuddle session. Jetstream shook his head heavily. What was he just thinking? It wasn't just about the intensity, right? He had to rid himself of all of the physical attraction for his daughter, right? Jetstream was jolted out of his anxious musing as his door pony, Zero Gustav, intercepted him on his way to the penthouse suite elevator. "Hello, sir. Just wanted to report that no one has gone up and down from your suite since we last spoke." Jetstream sighed, giving Zero a nod of thanks as he stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the penthouse suite's floor. At least one thing was going right so far today. He'd been so worried that Apogee might make an ill-advised escape during his trip to the pharmacy, and in her current state, that would have been disastrous. In no time at all, he found himself unlocking his front door, stepping inside his condo and quietly closing the door behind him. He wondered absent-mindedly if Apogee was still in his bedroom, perhaps wrapping herself in his silk sheets. His dirty silk sheets. He felt himself stir as he imagined his teenage daughter playing with herself, hoofing herself while she imagined him riding her. And again he shook his head in disbelief. What was wrong with him? He obviously needed this medication more than he realized. He trotted through the foyer, his nostrils already starting to dilate slightly at the scent of hormonal teenage sex juices drifting through the masculine olfactory organ. It troubled him that he could recognize the taste of Apogee's heat, a cinnamon-sweet mixture that made him swallow eagerly, drinking in every essence out of the air itself. At least the estrus scent was nowhere near as thick as it had been this morning when the pair had been overwhelmed by its effects. His heart froze as he approached the living room, as Jet heard something he wasn't expecting. Voices, as in more than one voice. "Did Dad like it when you played with his balls while you licked him, or was it Jetstream rounded the corner quickly, his eyes widening in surprise and shock. Apogee was speaking with Delta V, his ex, about playing with his testicles while licking him. Delta V looked up as she noticed Jet enter the room. She looked like her usual tired, sloppily put-together self. She seemed to be completely nonplussed by Jet's sudden appearance, regardless of her rather private nature of the current topic of conversation. She raised a hoof nonchalantly in greeting. "Hey." Apogee turned around so quickly, seeing her father for the first time. Her pupils shrunk and her eyes widened in shock. Jetstream felt himself reacting the same way to the current scenario. Just what had she told Delta? "What?" Jetstream croaked out. Delta V shrugged before leaning back on the couch. "I was just Delta." Jetstream began without solicitation, visibly shaking and sweating. "I just want to say that what happened was a total accident." Jetstream kept babbling and spilling the beans, his entire life flashing before his eyes as he tried to explain away the previous day's events. He was completely missing the signals Apogee was trying to send him. Her lips were pinched together and her head shaking vigorously in a desperate attempt to shut him up. "You see, when I got home, Okay, Dad, can I talk for just a second?" Apogee sprang off the couch, tackling her father in a half-hug, half-bulldoze, which she used as an excuse to push him to the first-floor bathroom, closing the door behind them, leaving behind a bemused but still tired Delta V alone on the couch in the living room. "Guess she really had to take a leak," Delta snarked aloud to herself, knowing that her kid was actually probably trying, in her usual way, to manage the interaction between her and Jetstream to a smooth outcome. Inside the bathroom, though, a very different discussion was taking place. "What is she doing here? What did you tell her?" Jetstream asked, keeping his voice as low as he could in a panicked state. "I don't know, she just showed..." Apogee paused, looking down at her hoof. She'd just stepped in something slimy, picking her forehoof up, tilting it to the front of her face, as she stepped in some of her father's juices left over from the pair's anal excursion the previous evening. no! Apogee whined petulantly, teenage filly that she was, before wiping away the nearby hand towel. Jetstream realized what his daughter had stepped in, looking around to smell the catastrophe that was the aftermath of just one of their fun activities, and couldn't help but slap his hoof to his forehead. Celestia, I am so royally bucked. No, Dad. Apogee shushed him with a hoof. I thought the same thing, but turns out Mom's got a burnt-out nose. She can't smell a thing. Jetstream whispered to her through clenched teeth, his stress not assuaged at all by his daughter's hopeful explanation. Then just why the hay were you two talking about out there? Apogee's head tilted in momentary confusion, so Jetstream elicited further. Apogee, why were you talking about playing with my, those? He stammered out, finding it awkward to speak with his teenage filly about his testicular stimulation preferences. Oh! Apogee clapped her hooves together. Well, Mom was just telling me about the first time you two slept together back at Columbian University. It was pretty cute. Apogee smiled at her dad. The first time He blushed, remembering that passionate night, the perfect night, with Delta. One of the few nights before their premarital relationship became such a horrible mess of passion, booze, fights, and excess. Yeah, Apogee smiled before becoming a little bashful. I wanted to find out from her what you liked for when we, Apogee trailed off, her whole face turning a deep crimson, a crimson only matched by the shade her father was currently sporting as he reacted to hearing his teenage filly admit that she was genuinely trying to find a way to improve her performance with him. The brief moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Are you two okay in there? Delta V's voice came through. Apogee quickly burst from the bathroom with her father in tow. Yes, she squeaked. Just had a bit of a bathroom emergency. Delta V arched an eyebrow. And what, you needed him to help wipe your butt? You Mom, don't be gross. Jetstream sighed and decided to bail on his daughter before she dug too deep a hole for both of them. He placed his hoof on the front of his daughter so he could easily step between her and Delta and take charge of the conversation. Apogee was trying to explain to me why her mother might be explaining to her teenage daughter everything about her father's preferred techniques. Now, it was Delta's turn to look a bit sheepish. She rubbed the back of her hoof behind a messy, bedraggled mane. Was not something a mom was supposed to share with a filly? Probably not. Oops, still she wasn't a big deal, was it? Delta tried to shrug it off. Whoops. Setting aside that, why exactly are you here, Delta? Jetstream asked, pointing a hoof at her. The kid kept one of my keys, as well as some. She looked over at Apogee, who was blushing before she decided to spare her teenage daughter from further embarrassment in front of her father. Some, stuff from my place that I need. I wanted to pick it up quickly. What's the big deal? Delta asked, starting to shift forward on her hooves. Jetstream frowned and shook his head ever so slightly. Delta V felt her eyebrows pinched together in anger, her tone becoming slightly more aggressive as she realized she was being interrogated by the very stallion who had dumped the filly on her at the beginning of the week in the first place. Hey, you're the one who's always inviting me over so that I can spend more time with our daughter in a more wholesome environment, as if my junkyard is some trash heap. Jetstream felt his voice begin to rise as well. It is a trash heap. That is the literal definition of a junkyard, and I didn't mean you could just fly in the window like I know you have done. You know, a little foreknotice, coming up the elevator like a civilized pony. Delta scoffed, her jaw setting forward in anger. Oh yeah, sure. I'll make sure next time to give a civilized pony like you plenty of forewarning so that I don't interrupt one of your disgusting romps with some calmare who lifts her tail for bits. Jetstream wasted no time before he barked back. Better than some pony who should be trying to pull her life back together but goes down to dive bars instead and lifts her tail for booze. And I have the right to know before some pony should just... And who they is that? Jetstream shouted in exasperation. Oh, that would be the pizza I ordered, Delta said neutrally, switching suddenly out of her building tone to anger and heading that way. Jetstream was so flummoxed that he could only stare at her in open-mouthed shock. What? I got hungry flying over here. My favorite pizza place is only a couple of blocks away. Delta began to trot toward the door, calling over her shoulder when she realized that Jet was still standing still, shocked into immobility by the pure audacity. What? I got enough for all of us. I'm not rude. Apogee chirped happily and bounced after her mom. Sweet. Did you get anyone with anchovies? Apogee followed her mom, tail swishing happily. Teenagers love pizza. Jetstream was left alone as he realized that his ex would be staying for lunch. He slapped his hoof back to his face, not for the first time that day. Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me. The three Pegasi were seated around the condominium's granite-topped kitchen island, a large pizza pie sitting between the three of them, steaming hot. Delta had quickly grabbed the pies from the pimply-faced earth pony, who had been escorted by a rather concerned-looking door pony, before looking back and nodding at her muzzle towards Jetstream, indicating that Jetstream would pay. Grumbling, the stallion had quickly given the bits to the pizza colts and given a curt nod to his doorman before slamming the door shut and heading to the kitchen. By the time he got there, his daughter was prancing around the island happily, waiting for the pizza to be served out as his ex set the boxes on the island. Jetstream quickly cleared the island of the various cereal boxes and bowls, and a dildo? He shook his head angrily, promptly tossing the object over to Delta, who clandestinely put it back into Apogee's bag. And finally, now that everything was all settled down, Jetstream doled out 3 plates and opened 2 cardboard pizza boxes before pulling up a stool. Delta on one side of the rectangular island, and Apogee seated next to her father on the other side. Jetstream glowered over the island at his ex and couldn't help tweaking her. That little thing's a bit small for a mare like you, wouldn't you say? Don't flatter yourself. It's not the size of the jumbo jet, it's the skill of the pilot, and honestly, I think you should never have gotten your pilot's license in the first place. Jet seethed before snarking back. Oh yeah, well this pilot has had thousands of hours of flight time since your last trip, unlike you. Delta smirked with her own dissatisfaction. Ha, this mare has had plenty of frequent flight. Can you guys stop? Apogee interrupted, rolling her eyes, a bit annoyed at her parents' childish antics. First of all, we've got pizza. Second of all, I know you're both arguing about sex. All you're doing is making me feel bad. Literally give it a rest already. Jetstream and Delta looked a bit shamefaced at their daughter's rebuke and both quietly reached for a slice of pizza. There was a brief period of silence that hung over the trio as they looked their first bites of the delicious cheesy pie. It didn't last. So, Delta began, unable to help herself. I hear Space said had a very good week in Canterlot. Too bad for your company, huh? Mom. Apogee warned, putting down one of her hooves on the countertop. Jetstream frowned. I didn't realize that garbage dump managers followed aerospace news. Dad. Apogee put her other hoof on the countertop. Was she really going to be playing referee? Again. Kid, you don't even know what we're talking about. Delta rolled her eyes at the teenage filly's antics. What I know is that both of you are just trying to hurt one another's feelings with your words. She took a bit of her cheese and anchovy pizza, but most of the time you just end up hurting mine. She sighed. Delta and Jet looked at one another across the island, a grimace of shame shared between the two of them before they both looked back down at their food, chastened. It was a stupid decision, Delta mumbled. What was that? Jetstream asked, looking up. I said it was a stupid decision by the Crown to pick Space said, Delta said before taking a bite of her pizza. Those stupid Space said rockets aren't using any new technology, except that they can land the initial stage automatically. Compared to Equestria Aero's spaceplane's single stage to orbit proposal, it was far less ambitious and had far fewer upsides. I know, Jetstream groaned. That stupid playboy Tesla just took one Gen 1 rocket technology, slapped some fancy automation and drone ship landing pads on it, and thinks that he's some sort of visionary. That plot hole should have just stuck to his tech company. Psh, totally, Delta agreed. The main engine on that cruddy Griffin X rocket they proposed is some kind of monopropellant peroxide fuel with a low specific impulse factor and some archaic carbureted fuel turbo pump. They might as well have tied a payload to a hot air balloon. Are you kidding me? The hot air balloon? At least that would be novel. Jetstream laughed. Do you know what his projected bit cost per pound to orbit was? Delta leaned over, smirking. No, tell me. 15,000 bits. Oh my gosh. You're kidding. That's about as bad as the old rockets they were using when they were still in college. Our space plane would have been half that cost, even on the Mark I version pilot shots. Jetstream grinned. I know it would have. Though even at Equestria, we still had to figure out how to handle the high atmosphere transition to hypersonic envelope insertion. I know. Delta finished for him. And I remember telling you back at Columbia that materials technology would catch up, and we could use the inevitable atmospheric compressions to skip along the shockwave front, right? I actually saw a paper at last week's Candelot Space Conference about variable inlet designs for scamjet engines, which we could use above 70,000 feet. Reminded me of that same paper you wrote in freshman year. Jetstream was getting animated, and a smile was growing across his face, matched by Delta V's, as they reminisced about the details of their joint work, designing Equestria's first spaceplane. Apogee had a dopey grin on her face as she listened to her two parents nerd out about various aerospace design concepts. She'd never seen the two of them like this, getting along. She could see the passion in their faces about the engineering. This was nice. The two ponies she loved more than anything in the world actually getting along. Sort of. At least getting along when having a discussion on a narrow subject. Apogee sighed. Why couldn't they act like this all the time? No. You could work around the same issue by using a thermic battery. It's a cutting-edge piece of unicorn tech. We didn't have it back in our old school days. They're so useful it feels like we're cheating. But they're as heavy as Celestia after the annual cake festival. It does save our design from needing to have a unicorn on board with a magical output capacity roughly equivalent to Starswirl the Bearded. Jetstream chuckled. Delta chuckled as well. That's good. You could probably save some weight on the avionics if you could replace those hornheads with a Pegasus commander. Reaction times and flight instincts are so lacking in those magic snobs. Getting tired of being left out of the conversation, Apogee put down her slice of pizza and spoke up. Do you guys ever want to fly your own rockets, or do you just want to design them? Both Jetstream and Delta V seemed to suddenly remember that Apogee was still there before they both burst out laughing at her question. Jetstream managed to recover first, clearing the tears out of his eyes. No one. It takes brains to build these things. He held his hoof out over the table. Not so much to fly them. Delta laughed, before reaching out and hoof-bumping Jet's outstretched hoof, completing the age-old Columbia rocket engineer's derisive insult of pilots. Delta realized that what she had done and quickly snatched a hoof back, frowning and Jetstream before turning and addressing her daughter. Heck, they ought to replace those hotshot Astro ponies with shaved monkeys or just send up empty rockets with instrumentation. Delta snarked as she gesticulated with her hooves animatedly, Jetstream nodding along in agreement with his ex's statement. Apogee pouted, feeling a bit embarrassed, her cheeks puffing out in shame as her parents shared another laugh. Well, the teenage mare straightened herself, pushing out her chest and ruffling her feathers, tapping her chest to her hoof. I would love to fly the spaceships you design. I think it's cool. A moment passed as Jetstream and Delta V looked at one another, then at their daughter. A smile of sincere pride crossing his lips as he looked fondly at his daughter. She just said she wanted to be an astronaut. That would make me pretty proud, kid. Delta V smiled for once as she thought about her overly energetic daughter piloting, heck, maybe even commanding an EASA mission. Delta felt her heart warm and fill and had to blink to prevent her eyes from getting watery. You'd have to improve your grades quite a bit, hun, Jetstream said, still smiling with pride, but I think you'd make a great space pilot. Apogee could feel the love on the table. She never experienced anything like this before. Two parents who loved her just looking at her with pride and fully believing in her. It was incredible. I'd only ever fly to space in something you guys designed, though. She chuckled before bashfully looking back at her pizza. And for the briefest of moments, all the arguing and pain of the past months were forgotten. And for that idyllic moment, all was right with a world for this little misfit family of three. Maybe, just maybe, this little family would make it. The moment passed by, slipping back into the cruel and ever-growing horizon of the past as they fell back into scented silence, and each grabbed their second slice of pizza. Apogee's second slice quickly went awry. Maybe it was the feelings of love from her parents. Maybe it was the energy she'd gotten back from the food she'd just eaten. Maybe it was the sense of embarrassment from speaking so candidly with her parents about her feelings and dreams. Or maybe it was the fact that her father's semen had been sufficiently absorbed by her body that it sensed she needed a fill-up. Whatever the reason, Apogee's heat began to rear its ugly head, the unstoppable, irrepressible force building once again. It started with her belly starting to feel a bit warm. She could tell right away it wasn't because the piping hot pizza in her stomach, as that perplexing warmth spread down to her nethers, forcing her to shift her little butt on her stool uncomfortably. The friction of her adjustment just made things worse, as she felt the heat's throbbing insistence begin to build in waves, each pump of her heart making her lower lips swell and her wings start to get achy and feel like they should be extended. Jetstream had noticed his father's dilemma rather quickly too. Partway through his second slice of pizza, he began to notice a scent that was overtaking even the fairly egregious smell of anchovies, even though he had none of his slices. He was begrudgingly thankful that Delta had ordered a second pie with just cheese. He never could understand how his daughter and ex liked the taste of such a disgusting fish topping. No longer was the aroma of baked cheese and fish able to drown out the smell of an aroused teenage filly pussy, and his nostrils immediately flared at the returning hint of a musky cinnamon in the air, which he knew was coming out of his daughter's body. He glanced over at the corner of his eye to see that Apogee was unsurprisingly squirming in her seat, one of her hooves rubbing the lower abdomen, her teenage wings ever so slightly starting to extend into the middle of her back. Her face was already blushing red in exertion, and her lips were parting ever so slightly as she gave out hot little hasps of breath. Crap. Excuse me for a second. I need to use the toilet. Apogee, could you come with me for a moment? He asked over his shoulder as he trotted towards the first floor bathroom. Huh? Apogee dreamily looked over at her father, woken out of a reverie. Oh yeah, sure. She hopped off the stool as well, and Jetstream nervously prayed that Delta V didn't see the conspicuous and sticky strand of Philly juice that stretched between his daughter's plot and its spot on the stool, before it finally fell to the gossamer thread on the floor below. He put a hoof around her shoulders and escorted her from the kitchen, leaving Delta V to her pizza. Delta V took another big bite, chewing and swallowing before muttering to herself, "What's with those two? Are they bathroom buddies or what? Is a kid-parent mutual butt wiping some parental bonding thing I don't know about?" She shrugged and took another big chomp, most likely the two things once again going behind her back to discuss the latest foul paw she'd unknowingly messed up. She sighed, resting her hoof on her chin belatedly. When she never bothered to try and visit, she had no idea. "Dad, I think I'm..." Apogee nuzzled her dad's neck as soon as the bathroom door was closed. The filly paused to rub her thighs together, her rapid breath landing hotly on her father's nape. Jetstream swallowed deeply, his hooves stroking his daughter's back comfortingly, reassuringly. "I know, hon." He unconsciously let one of his hooves trail down to her flank, kneading the pert teenage muscle there. Apogee immediately moaned into his neck and tried to lean into the exploring hoof, her tail flagging and swishing her musk all throughout the bathroom's constrained atmosphere. Jetstream pulled away his hoof and her flank quickly, fighting the urge to drive his mouth against his daughter's gasping muzzle and send his hoof to explore even further south. "I know, hon. I know it's back. I can smell it on you." "Dad, can we..." Apogee mealed, her dewy eyes looking up at him, begging him. "Later, hon. Your mom's here right now, remember?" Jetstream wasn't even shocked at himself for promising to satisfy his teenage filly later, as if it was no big deal. "For now, I'm gonna give you some medicine. It's gonna make everything better, okay, sweetheart?" He produced a brown paper bag that he'd left in the bathroom earlier. "Please, Dad." Apogee moaned, one of her hooves starting to reach down to her father's flank. Whether she was begging for the medicine or begging for his medicine was any pony's guess. Jetstream hurriedly looked at the bottle, trying to decipher the symbols to discern the proper dosing to give. But it was all for naught. He couldn't understand the strange glyphs in Zebrakin language. Apogee laid a long, begging lick across his neck. Crap, he was running out of time here. It wasn't a large bottle, perhaps a quarter dose for her? He uncorked the top. Here, hun, Apogee looked up at him, her eyes half-lidded and dreamy with desire. She opened her cute little muzzle as wide as she could and said revealing her flat pink tongue and throat. Little strands of sticky saliva connecting the roof of her mouth and her lips as she gasped heavily with hot pants. Jetstream paused for a moment as he imagined ramming his stallion hood down her throat and exploding in her. He shook his head. Focus! He poured a good dollop, about a quarter of the bottle, into his daughter's tongue, watching the pink liquid slide down the slick, withering muscle into her throat before she straightened the cork on the bottle. Now swallow, hun. Apogee did as directed, and faint glow of activating magic visibly sliding down her slender throat and into her belly. Good job, hun. It'll get better soon, I promise. Now let's head back out there before your mom gets suspicious, okay? Apogee mewed, her tail seductively flicking about high in the air. Okay, Dad. He turned his daughter around, opening the door and directing her back towards the kitchen with a gentle push on her cute little butt. He felt something sticky and looked down to see his hoof was wet with his daughter's slick nectar, a silvery strand connecting it to the departing daughter's plot. He followed the strand back to its origin, immediately seeing a set of hot teenage filly pussy lips swollen and dripping under Apogee's flagging tail, winking invitingly just for him. Sweet mother bucking Celestia, Jetstream murmured to himself as he felt his stallion head begin to spill from its sheath. He lifted his sticky hoof to his mouth, tasting the incredible sweetness of his daughter's pure arousal, giving in to the desire one last time before taking what he thought was a suppressant. I really hope that this stuff is as strong as the pharmacist said it was. Jetstream tilted the bottle back in his own mouth, swallowing another quarter of its contents. 'Cause I sure as ain't need it. He left the bathroom as well, hoping his awkward shuffle would hide his growing erection. On the way back to the table, Jetstream felt something strange shifting through his body. The warmth from the potion he had just swallowed was branching out in all directions from his gut, racing out along each artery and vein to all of his extremities. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling, just tingly and powerful. It was slowly making him feel more and more uncomfortable, however, not exactly the satiating and suppressing effect he'd been hoping for. He paused briefly to reach down with a forehoof to scratch his balls nervously as he left the living area. Something was wrong. Most of these tingling sensations were starting to congregate in his nether regions. He could feel the potion's effects as the sensations slid in and around his reproductive organs, swelling and shifting him. The caress of the magic could be felt throughout the various glands and vessels in his abdomen and tissue in and around his testicles and, of course, his cock. Celestia, could he ever feel it there? The tingles had accumulated enough to feel like a burning warmth by the time that he rounded the corner into the kitchen, and thankfully, Deltavia was looking the other way while concentrating on her latest slice of pizza. Otherwise, there would have been no way she could have missed the massive erection he was sporting. Jetstream took his seat next to his daughter, instantaneously being assaulted by her estrus's rich perfume. Poor Apogee seemed to be stewing in a cauldron of her own juices. A 1,000-yard stare was stuck on her face as she bit her lower lip. It seemed both of them desperately needed this potion to kick in sooner than later. And kick in it did. Just as Jetstream reached around to pick up a slice of pizza, he felt that burning warmth becoming more and more insistent. It took every ounce of his willpower not to reach around the table with one of his hooves and stroke his suddenly aching shaft, or better yet, to simply tackle the overpowering source of teenage pheromones sitting next to him and rut her into oblivion. But he staved off those animalistic desires as the burning throbs pulsed more and more powerfully. His fear continued to ratchet up as he felt his cock straining under the effects of whatever the potion was. Was this some unforeseen side effect? Something was definitely wrong. His cock was getting hotter and colder? Jetstream suddenly felt a coolness against his cockhead and shivered for a moment before he realized that his flare was now pressing up against the bottom of the kitchen island. Something it had never done before while sitting on these stools. Even when he'd had the most raging morning of wood hard on in his life and sat down for coffee, it still left a small gap between the tip of his dick and the underside of the granite countertop. And discreetly, as he could possibly manage, Jetstream leaned back to get a better angle to see just what was going on under the table, and then immediately squeaked in wide-eyed shock and straightened up bolt upright, stunned by what he had just seen. "Huh? Did you say something?" Delta asked from the other side of the table. "Nothing." Jetstream peeped out as he started sweating profusely. What the buck was that? He asked himself. What he'd seen was shocking. His stallion hood, which he was intimately familiar with ever since he was a young colt, larger than he had ever seen it before by no small margin, thicker, longer, darker. It looked obscenely menacing, like it belonged to one of those zebras in those ridiculous porn movies. And where his cock had probably been 11 inches long and as wide as its base of a filly's foreleg yesterday, now it was pushing 15, and the fat throbbing base was easily as wide if not wider than his own hoof, and it was drooling. Jetstream started to pick up on the sensations other than the still continuous throbs and realized that he could feel the rivulets of pre-cum sliding down his now longer shaft, trailing down to where his balls lay against the stool seat top, making an absolute puddle in his pubic fur and lap, and still, those hot, magically induced throbs weren't stopping. He could feel his flare getting pressed more and more firmly into the cool granite underside of the island. As the shaft continued to agonizingly stretch, slowly and inevitably, the pressure being applied to his swollen flare had reached a level that it was too uncomfortable to stand any further. And then just as he was about to reach down and adjust himself so his larger stallion hood could rest more comfortably along the underside of the table instead of into the underside, it happened. He started to come. A lot. What the buck? His mind shouted internally, even as it was flooded by orgasmic pleasure chemicals. He hadn't even touched himself. He'd never had a hoof-free orgasm before. Jetstream clenched the edge of his table and leaned forward, gritting his teeth as he involuntarily performed little bucking gyrations in his seat. Splatter after splatter of thick cum was shooting from his now rigid flare as he tried desperately not to scream out loud from the incredible sensation of his ongoing massive ejaculation. He could hear the sound of his prodigious amounts of seed spilling to the floor beneath the island, and thankfully it wasn't a floating island type. There was a solid section of rich mahogany wood between him and the underside of the countertop. If there wasn't, he'd currently be hosing down Delta V's legs with heavy ropes of thick spurting cum. Perhaps Delta couldn't hear well over the sounds of her chewing because the splatter pitter-patter sound of thick semen as it shot in heavy jets from his cockhead before ricocheting off the underside of the table and either falling to the floor or painting the side of the mahogany pillar seemed cacophonous to Jetstream. He squinted his eyes shut. At this point, there was nothing he could do. He was along for the ride. He grimaced while trying desperately not to moan aloud as his overwhelmingly intensive and long-lasting orgasm continued. Splatter, splatter, splatter. Buck, he'd never come this much as an entire life, even when he was a teenage colt in high school clopping to his posters of Wonderbolt mares. Splatter, splatter, splatter. It just wasn't stopping. Apogee seemed to have taken notice of something going on under the countertop and looked over at her father. She, too, had a rather rough return from the bathroom to the table. While in the cramped and musky bathroom, Apogee wanted nothing more than for her father to nip at her neck, bend her over on the sink, and pound his stallion hood into her, and give her the bucking she so desperately needed. Instead, she had been saddened when he'd meekly turned her away with a dosage of medication. As Apogee began her walk back toward the kitchen island countertop, turning to exit the cramped bathroom, she'd felt the welcome press of her father's strong hoof against her butt and her marehood. It made her heart skip a beat as she trotted through the living room. It was about then that she got the cooling effects of the potion, or what she thought was the cooling effects of the potion. Starting in her belly and spreading outwards, each racing throb of her heart seemed to deliver the dancing electric tingles to the far-reaching extremities of her teenage body. But most especially, her pulses seemed to be sending them to her aching, moist fillyhood. At first, it seemed like the tingles were helping, bringing a welcome change in sensation to Apogee's already engorged and burning, drooling lower lips, but very quickly the horny filly could tell that something wasn't working as intended. A huge pressure seemed to be building up from her tingles, making everything down there swell and throb worse. Unlike ever before, she could feel her little clitoris parting in dripping folds that grew larger. In fact, by the time she reached her seat, the throbbing love bud was engorged large enough to ever so delicately brush the cold wooden top of the stool, causing a chain reaction of sensation that immediately made Apogee's powerful teen vaginal muscles clench and wink. And what a wink it was. Apogee felt racing shivers of electricity trail up and down her spine as her fillyhood spasmed agonizingly, shooting her already engorged clit in and out from its nesting spot in her hot folds and mashing her sex button against the cool stool top. Her little wings shot out to either side rigidly, as she nearly dropped the slice of pizza she was holding as she felt herself flood the stool with a massive squirt of filly cum. The torrent of transparent liquid sprayed out in gooey, sticky strands down to the floor below, and yet she just kept clenching in and out, again and again, as her body was racked with a powerful convulsion that drove her to grind her hips into the stool. Apogee's lust mounted with each wave, her breasts starting to come in raspy little gasps, her hips were gyrating faster and faster, and her vision was going fuzzy. Right when she was on the edge of an actual orgasm, the winking finally began to taper off, and as her breathing returned to normal, she caught a pleasant smell in her cute little nose. She also noticed that her father seemed to be clenching the edge of the table in some distress. Apogee's nostrils flared as she looked at the rugged, masculine dad. Celestia, she wanted him to push her up onto the countertop and mount her roughly from behind. Did he even know how good he smelled right now? Apogee writhed in her seat, feeling the bottom get absolutely soaked from the pool of her own juices she'd just deposited there. Celestia help her, she just wanted to bathe in the scent wafting up from under the island. The oaky, almondy, acorn-like bitterness. Wait, she knew that smell. Was he coming? He was. Apogee squeaked quietly, and badly desire essence her body was screaming for was right there. With so much biological, animalistic imperative driving the little filly, she couldn't help herself. She let her hoof, the one closest to her father, shot out from under the table, searching hungrily for its target. Apogee's eyebrows lifted in gleeful surprise as she felt the hot, heavy, pulse-throbbing stallion shaft there, and it was already a gooey, creamy mess. She was beginning to wrap her hoof around her father's shaft when she realized, to her surprise, it seemed different than it had this morning. Larger? Thicker? Hotter? Like a large extent. Almost a shocking extent. The unexpected additional attributes were so stunning that Apogee pulled her hoof back as if she'd just been stung. Still trying to process what she just felt, the teenage filly lifted her sticky hoof back up above the edge of the table clandestinely, before getting a wicked idea. Using the facade of raising her slice of pizza back to her muzzle, she brought the hot sticky goo on her hoof up as well. Carrying the creamy semen to her mouth, faking a small bite of pizza, she instead took a big lick of her father's warm full batter off her left hoof. The explosion of taste was incredible. Her body immediately demanded that she got more of this wondrous substance inside of her, and inside her now. Apogee couldn't help but close her eyes and give out a long, satisfied moan, as she felt her body tremble with delight from the creamy treat sliding down her throat. Delta V looked across the table at her daughter with a smile. "Yeah, I hear you, kid. It's my favorite too. Tastes good, huh?" Apogee nodded, her eyes still closed before she finished her swallow with a breathy little expiration. "Oh yeah, I think it's my favorite too. It tastes incredible." Apogee dropped both her hooves to her belly, patting it with satisfaction before slyly only returning one of her hooves to the countertop. Delta's ears perked up as Jetstream suddenly let out a breath it looked like he had been holding for 2 minutes before panting slightly with some sort of exertion. His eyes seemed to be spinning lazily in their sockets as he finally let his death grip on the table edge go. He usually composed stallion shakily raised a hoof back towards the pizza as he intended to grab another slice. Delta looked at him with an arched eyebrow. You okay over there?" Jetstream managed to nod and tried to wave her off. "Yep. But as he picked up another slice of pizza, he squeaked aloud as his wings shot out to full extension. the pizza slice flopping messily to the countertop partway between his plate and the box. Apogee was staring out nonchalantly away from the table, only one hoof above the countertop, but she had the most wickedly mischievous grin on her face. Delta suspiciously looked at the two ponies acting strangely opposite her. She was about to call them weirdos, before she realized that would probably be a pot calling a kettle black. So instead, she simply shrugged and took another bite of her delicious anchovy pizza. Under the island countertop on the opposite side, lots of things were happening. Things that were making Jetstream's teeth grit in ecstasy. Poor Jetstream had just been through a roller coaster of emotions and physical sensations. He'd almost lost all control when Apogee had gripped his mid-shaft as he was still in the throes of spurting, but thankfully the filly had withdrawn her hoof almost immediately. A few heavy, powerful spurts after that, he had finally felt his seemingly never-ending orgasm taper off. The muscles in his abdomen finally relaxed as his stallionhood ceased its endless barrage, which had led him to breathing and shaking heavily as he reached for another slice of pizza. The poor stallion had finally been able to release a hold on the counter edge to catch his breath, his head swimming with the dangerous mixture of pleasure and panic. Surely, after such an intense, prolonged climax like this one he'd just survived, he had been fully drained. Right? His cock should be softening and retreating back to its sheath rather quickly. Right? Not even close. Unbelievably, Jetstream felt his rigid member continue to throb angrily. It may have stopped spurting, but it was still raring to go. The one upside of his ejaculation was that the organ was now slick enough that it slid out against the underside of the counter, which was a good thing. Otherwise, it would probably be cracking through the granite by now if it was still facing upward. Jetstream had then tried to cover up the discombobulated state by reaching forward to grab another slice of pizza. Sure, his forearm was shaky, and he was huffing like a marathon runner, but everything was going fine. The pizza was on its way back to his plate when he felt an unexpected hoof wrap suddenly around his massive shaft, and though this was unexpected size, it could barely make it halfway around. He had dropped the pizza, stifling a yelp. His wings shot out in arousal as he felt a hoof begin to stroke slowly upward, milking him from the base of his cock, now a tangled mess of mop of gooey pubic fur, before starting to squeeze its way up his shaft. Celestia, it was so good. Apogee's little hoof couldn't get halfway around the throbbing shaft, and yet it still felt incredible as she punctuated her smooth upward stroke with little wiggles and squeezes. Apogee smiled across the table at her mother as the filly took an actual bite of pizza from the less busy hoof. "Where did you get this from anyway, Mom?" Under the table, the slick remainder of her father's climax lubricated her ongoing stroking, which went up his shaft and up and up. Celestia, just how long was he? Delta swallowed her bite and gave her a little smile. "It's called My Little Pizzeria. It's just down the street from here." "Oh, how'd you find it?" Apogee asked absent-mindedly, her focus actually on her hoof as it finally found the edge of her father's flare. Buck, it was so swollen right now. She tenderly slid her delicate underhoof over the ridge, massaging what she knew must be a painful throbbing glance for her poor father. Next to the grinning naughty filly, Jetstream bit down on his cheek, his eyes crossing in ecstasy. His daughter was giving his cockhead such an exquisite and gentle rub-down, bringing him tantalizingly closer and closer to another climax. He was so close now, Celestia, and she just had to... Delta looked down at her pizza crust to pick it up, and Apogee seized the window of opportunity. At lightning speed, she brought her massaging hoof up to her mouth, sticking the whole thing almost comically into her muzzle so she could take her time lapping up her father's cream, which she had gathered beneath the countertop. Delta looked up, still nibbling on her crust. "Hoof looking good, huh?" she joked, using a line from the popular commercial that was playing throughout Equus. "Mm-hmm," Apogee agreed, as she swallowed the thick cum she just scooped onto her mouth, shutting her eyes in pleasure. It was so fulfilling. Her wings fluttered with joy at the taste in her belly, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. Apogee lifted her cloth napkin to her lips, patting her daintily and conspicuously, and then she dropped the piece of fabric so that it fell to the floor. "Oops." Apogee pushed her stool back. "I'll get it." She ducked under the table, leaving her parents to stare at each other across the island. An awkward silence descended over the both of them. Delta took another bite of pizza, a frown appearing on her face, not because she was left alone with Jetstream, but because she felt so inadequate, so awkward in these situations. She was so bad at regular family conversation stuff like this. All she'd been talking about for the past 5 minutes was frickin' pizza. Come on, Delta, think of something to say. So, how's your pizza? God damn it. Jetstream was making a strange face. One of his eyes was twitching as he had a big dopey grin that stretched from ear to ear. It's really good, he sighed, letting his tongue hang lazily from his mouth, making Delta grin and look at him with a bemused face. It was pretty good. Under the island, Apogee had just finished giving her father's enlarged cock a full tongue bath. The moment she ducked under the island countertop in search for her napkin, she had hungrily attacked her father's larger-than-normal stallionhood, her tongue tracing up the hot, throbbing shaft and lacking up thick, creamy remaining juices from the massive eruption. The longer, wider rod rubbed into her mane as she nuzzled her way down the base of her father's penis, licking up the sticky mess that had accumulated there. She buried her nostrils into his musky, sweaty balls, coating them in a layer of her saliva as she suckled and licked aggressively, eager to absorb every last bit of his cum. Breaking off her lascivious licking of her father's balls, which she could swear had gotten larger than this morning as well, with an audible little pop, Apogee said aloud to her mother, could hear, "Dad, my napkin's stuck under the stool. I'm having trouble getting it," before she immediately nuzzled his dick, grinding his face against the huge fleshy rod as she dragged her tongue up its impressive length once again. Jetstream smiled goofily across his Delta as he answered his naughty little filly. You'll just have to try a little harder to get it, hon." Delta just rolled her eyes, perplexed at Jetstream's strange behavior, before she took another bite of pizza. She felt awkward, out of place, but she really had no idea how a family meal was supposed to go. Apogee felt the father squeezing his muscles, suspending his heavy stallionhood, making it twitch and bounce against her face. She had finally finished licking the entire pole clean of its coating of daddy batter. Celestia, she could feel her body starting to react already, demanding even more of her father's sauce, but there was no more to be had on the jet black skin of his shaft, or in the sweaty musky fur of the pubic region. She was giving a serious thought to lapping the large pool of cum that had splattered and run down the island underside. Just before she bent down to do just that, a better idea came to mind. Why not get some fresh batter? She moved her muzzle quickly up her father's long shaft, her tongue tracing up and down along the flare to caress his arcing ridge and turgid flesh. So she placed her other hoof on his shaft, keeping him steady as she leaned in, booping the end of his cock against her cute little nose, before opening her mouth and suckling the drooling cock slit. Jetstream squeaked as he felt his daughter's soft lips form a seal around his sensitive slit. "Ma'am, sorry, I had something stuck in my throat." Jetstream made a conciliatory excuse to his ex. Delta looked at him with a deadpan glance. "Make sure to chew properly." Delta felt the face hoofing herself. "Make sure to chew properly." Celestia, she felt like an awkward idiot. Apogee had begun to ever so slightly suckle like a hungry foal at her mother's teat, sucking the sweet cum that she desired so badly out of her father's urethral tube. The remaining from Jetstream's massive organ began to be drawn out like a thick milkshake being pulled through a straw. The delicious creamy fluid dribbled out in small squirts into the teenage filly's mouth, falling onto her lashing pink tongue, which raced against the underside of her glands. Jet felt his balls beginning to throb and ache again, the fluid within boiling and building for another massive release. He almost couldn't believe it. How could he be ready to come again? This soon after the recent massive explosion, he was surprised he had any fluid left him in at all. The inevitable climax continued to approach. His horny little filly continued stroking her father's larger, longer, more aggressive shaft with both of her hooves while sucking his semen from his drooling cock slit. Jetstream felt his hips beginning to buck again. He felt himself trotting close to the cliff edge of orgasm, just a little more. He felt his flare begin to stiffen up again and the powerful muscles in his abdomen start to clench. "Apogee, kid, you doing okay?" Delta asked, realizing that she hadn't seen her daughter for almost an entire minute. not since she had ducked under the countertop in search of a napkin. Apogee broke her mouth seal, with Jet's penis with a slurp sucking a thick strand of cum juice right out of her swollen slit, like it was some obscene noodle of liquid spaghetti, before unhappily popping her head up over the edge of the counter back into view of her mom. Got it. Apogee held up the napkin in triumphance. Stupid thing was stuck. Didn't want to give up and just give me what I wanted. Apogee used the napkin to again daintily wipe her muzzle, this time actually wiping off some unspeakable juices before they could be noticed by her mother. Okay. Aren't you gonna eat any more of your food? Delta motioned towards the pizza still sitting on Apogee's plate. Nah, I think I'm good for pizza. Feeling full? Jetstream asked. Apogee turned her head to look at her father with a coy grin. Her eyes danced with mischief. Nah, I definitely don't feel full. Just don't feel like eating right now. Jetstream grinned back at her, wiggling his eyebrows slightly before looking over to Delta. So what's your plan for the rest of the day? Need me to call you a taxi carriage? Delta cleaned her hooves with her own napkin before putting it down on her empty plate. Nah, it's okay. I was hoping to get a little tour of the place before I go. Jetstream's grinning face fell. What? Why, you're usually the last pony who wants to put up with niceties like house tours, and you definitely never usually want to spend any more time near me than you have to. Apogee kicked her father in the shin under the countertop, shooting him a glare. Dad? Delta got a smirk of mischief of her own, one that made Jetstream realize just how eerily she resembled her daughter. That's true, but I am actually a bit interested in how your rich, fat ass gets to live it up. It is the life I was supposed to have, after all. As Jed made ready to reply with some snide remark about Delta being the one with too much junk in the trunk, she cut him off, her grin now a beaming smile. Besides, usually you're trying to get me to stick around so I take off. Now that you're trying to get rid of me, I figure I'll stick around for a bit, just to piss you off. Jetstream's face was turning red with anger. He wanted Delta gone ASAP. The longer she was here, the more likely that everything would get revealed. They were already taking insane risks. Even more importantly, though, the longer she was here, the longer it would be before he could pull Apogee down and pound her teenage pussy into happy oblivion. He snorted out at the thought of her tight fillyhood wrapping around him, all delaying his bratty mare. All delayed by this bratty mare. Jetstream puffed up his chest, slamming one hoof to the ground. Now see here, why don't you Of course, Mom. Apogee had sprung off her stool as she was dancing on her hoof tips in excitement. Let me give you the tour. We'll start with the living room. She began to trot around the island. Great, Jetstream thought, slinking down on his stool and letting his chin rest on his hooves, glowering as Delta shot him a shit-eating victory grin. Just great. What was that filly thinking? As Apogee walked past him, once again she was out of her mother's sight. She groped his flank with the right hoof, followed by a playful tail flick against his own tail, their strands intertwining briefly as her tailbone brushed against his flank seductively. By Celestia, Jetstream gulped. She wasn't thinking. Not with her head, at least. Apogee bounced ahead happily, turning her beckon to her mom to come with her as the filly chatted happily to no one in particular. So, Dad moved to this place 2 years ago. Before then, we lived in a building just over there. She pointed with her other hoof through the floor to the ceiling plate glass windows. It wasn't nearly as nice as this place, but it did have a pool. Delta grimaced and nodded as the pair trotted into the living room. A pool, huh? I've got one of those. Apogee chuckled back. Oh, come on, Mom. That blast crater behind the junkyard doesn't count. Apogee directed her mom into a wide and spacious living area, which had ceilings that stretched all the way up to the top of the second story, leaving a wide open-air area perfect for Pegasi. Watching from the kitchen, Jetstream chewed his lip and waited for an opportune moment to spring from his stool. Now, he sprinted out of the kitchen and propped himself against the back of the foul leather couch, leaning in such a way that his throbbing erection was pressed against the fabric of the couch back, invisible to the two mares in front of him. Delta looked over at him with an arched eyebrow as she curiously considered his strange posture. I see you've got one of those fancy big screen TVs. She glowered as the old flames of betrayal began to smolder up from inside of her. I've only got some shitty piece of crap 15-incher. Jetstream looked past his ex's angry face, nervously watching his daughter adopt a wicked grin as she bent over seductively on the coffee table, her tail flicking back and forth. Oh, Dad's got a 15-incher too, I bet. She wiggled her eyebrows to her father a bit. I bet he probably brings it out in the bedroom at night. Apogee covered her muzzle as she chuckled at her father's panicky discomfort. Delta continued staring down Jetstream, who was now sweating nervously. I doubt that. Wouldn't be surprised if he has another big fancy TV up there. Seriously, this bucket monster probably costs more than I make in a year, and you're enjoying all of this off of my hard work, which you continue to take credit for. Jetstream rolled his eyes. He really didn't want to get into this argument right now. If it makes you feel any better, about the only thing that plays on that TV is Apogee's Potato Ponies. I never have time to watch anything. He watched his filly in question pick up the remote control for the TV gingerly, bringing it up to her muzzle. What was she doing? Delta continued looking at him incredulously. Seriously? You never watched the hoofball games? The Las Pegasus Platinum Knights are going to playoffs this year. Jetstream stammered. His attention had been drawn to Apogee currently seductively licking the remote control, all while keeping her eyes on him, doling out long, aggressive licks that started at the base of the remote and traced lavishly up to the tip, and then she paused there for a moment, giving little flicking licks to the top of the remote with the end of her tongue, all just behind her oblivious mother. What? Delta grumbled. Seriously, I bet the picture quality is great. I, on the other hand, can barely tell the difference between the ball and the ground on my POS TV. Jetstream swallowed heavily, watching Apogee start filleting the remote, pumping it in and out of her muzzle with sloppy strands of drool trailing out of her mouth. You're always welcome to stop by and watch the game, you know. I'm sure Apogee would love it if you drop by. Jetstream barely managed to squeak out that last word as Apogee removed the remote from her mouth, then brought it down to her rear end. She paused, shot her dad a grin, looked Jet directly in his eyes, and slitheredly mouthed out, "Love you, Dad," before plunging her hoof forward. The filly's eyes shut in bliss, and her head leaned back as she bit her lip in passionate ecstasy. Jetstream couldn't see for sure where she just inserted his TV remote control, but he had a pretty good guess. His wings involuntarily shot out to either sides of him and resisted his efforts to awkwardly fold them back in. Delta paused, seeing his wings shoot out, mistaking Jet's reaction for fear. Delta's face softened slightly, changing from angry and belligerent to a mere scowl. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you, it's just that it's all such a load of bullshit. She sighed, rubbing her face with her hoof, trying to calm herself. But I don't think I'd come over for any hoofball matches. You've got no booze in the fridge. What's the point of hoofball without a cold one? Delta suddenly wheeled on Apogee, who quickly straightened up and brought all her hooves to their normal standing position. Her face scrunched and red with shock as she did her utmost not to reveal that she had stuffed herself with a plastic remote. Sorry, kid. Maybe I'd come if your dad sprung for the cider. Apogee just nodded nervously, trying to avoid her mother's gaze, as if she was keeping something in. Delta tilted her head in curiosity. Hello? Earth to kid? Something you want to let out? Jetstream quickly spoke up. Upstairs. Delta turned back around at Jet's outburst, giving Apogee a moment she needed to reach back and extract the remote control. Jetstream didn't miss the squirt of filly juice as she spilled the object from wherever it had been and put it back sticky and juicy on the coffee table. Well, let's take the tour upstairs. Jet smiled nervously, still pressing his unrelenting erection against the back of the sofa. Apogee hopped forward, took her mom by the shoulders, and began to lead her up the modern-style stairs with Jetstream following closely behind. He could barely hear Apogee's chattering on about some of the pictures that they'd hung on the walls next to the stairs from various events in the young filly's life. He was too busy looking at the two beautiful mare butts in front of him. On the left was his daughter's cute little rump, her tight ponnet nestled under her tail bun, all perched over a heavy, swollen and dripping set of filly lips. Her clitoris was fully exposed in a constant state of extension. Even though she wasn't currently winking, and a constant stream of filly juice ran over it and down her plump vulva, forming sticky trails that ran down her inner thighs. And to her right was a more mature and rounded pair of flanks for Jet to ogle. Delta's rich blue-green tail hung in the way, blocking what would otherwise be a clear view, but as it swished back and forth, he was afforded many opportunities to drink in his ex's plot. She still had that ever-so-plump ponnet that he had loved to play with in college, a lovely round ring of muscle that she had always hated when he'd insisted on having some butt fun, before she would eventually roll around and finally end up being the one begging for more anal stimulation. Just under that were Delta's lovely mare lips. They weren't swollen or dripping like her daughters currently were, but damn, if they weren't just as inviting. And just under that, on Delta V's belly, he could see the swell a pair of well-sized teats, looking none the worse for wear despite Delta's middle age. Celestia, he loved to motorboat those teats. Wait, what? What was he thinking? He sighed, rubbing his temples. The question was more probably, what was he thinking with? It definitely wasn't his upper head. Still, he just had to lean forward a bit to get a little more of that incredible estrus aroma into his nostrils. He took one step up the stairs toward the two mares who had just paused on their ascent to look at yet another framed photograph. So close to the origin now, he was mere inches away from Apogee's soft, drooling lips. He could really stop there. He opened his mouth and leaned closer, and Apogee abruptly took another couple of steps up the stairs to point out something specific in the photo to her grumpy mother. Jetstream fumed in annoyance for the moment, before his brain reset, selecting a new target. It was no big deal. There was another perfectly good target right in front of him. Huh? Delta jumped, her tail tucking between her legs as she whirled around. What the hey? Jetstream's eyes were wide with shock and concern. What had he just done? Sorry, I wasn't watching where I was trotting and just, Delta rubbed her butt with her hoof, glaring at Jetstream with a furious blush across her features. But Jet had no trouble seeing the genuine fury lit up in her eyes as she poked him in the chest angrily with her hoof. I know, plot kissing comes natural to a sycophant like you. But watch where you're walking, you asshole. With that, she whirled around, keeping her tail tucked between her flanks now, and continued walking up the stairs to catch back up with her daughter. Apogee shot him a sympathetic glance over her shoulder as she walked ahead of her mom, the naughty grin still stuck on her face. Jetstream sighed before licking his lips, still tasted like sweet grapes even after all of these years. Delta had quickly turned down the offer to see the master bedroom, saying she'd just seen it earlier that morning. In actuality, she had no interest in seeing that her ex culminated his conquest. There was a deep part of her that hated that he was still socially active, still able to bed beautiful mares with abandon, while she was stuck with the dregs of a local bar scene. So instead, they'd taken a left down the hallway to Apogee's room, and thankfully for Jet, the trip to Apogee's room had been completely taken up by the bouncy little mare showing every poster she had, trophy and memento, to her beloved mom, affording her no opportunity to perform yet another risky cock tease of some type, until they were leaving the room, that is. Apogee had held open the door to let her parents out first, playing the part of the well-mannered filly. First, Delta had trotted out to the second-floor landing with no incident, and then, as Jet walked past his daughter, she'd reached out with her nearest wing and ducked under his barrel quickly, clandestinely stroking one of her primaries from the tip of his shaft down to its base, making him shiver along his entire barrel. She'd smirked happily to himself with an outstretched tongue, as a small squirt of pee had drooled from the floor, leaving a sticky trail from her bedroom door to the final stop of the grand inspection. The last room on their little tour, Jet's library and ensuite study. The trio trotted into the new room, the style markedly different from the modern aesthetics of the rest of Jet's condo. Rich oaks, thick carpets signaled that this room was for serious study. Delta whistled to herself as she walked past the library bookshelves, inspecting the various tomes that were in scorn there, before a certain set caught her eye. Are those first edition Von Pons? Delta rushed over to the beautiful ornate books, almost drooling as she looked over the intricately bound set of engineering texts. Nice. Gotta say, wish that I had those. All I've got are some crappy printouts of the important bits of his work. Jet winced at the venom he heard in her voice and chose his words carefully. He knew that Warner Von Pon was Delta's hero, and he didn't want to set the Shirley Pegasus off on yet another tirade if he could help it. Yeah, I've tried to take good care of him. He was an incredible scientist. Delta rumphed, a little disappointed that Jet hadn't risen to take her bait. Ignoring his meek statement, she pushed forward through a set of French doors, separating the small library from Jet's personal study and office. And what's this in here, I wonder? Jet hopped towards Delta, getting ready to cut her off to intercept her and tell the nosy mare that his office was off limits, when he got a face full of blue-tailed teenage flank in his trouble. Apogee had used her mother's distraction as an opportunity to take flight into a low hover before skillfully backing up into Jet's face to deliver a playful butt check. Delta entered the smallish study, leaving the French doors open behind her as she heard a grumbling and giggling clatter as Apogee pulled some kind of mischief on her dad. Always up to something, that little filly. Delta ceased her musing and took stock of her surroundings. Her eyes opened in slight surprise as she noticed that the walls and floors were covered in papers, design documents, corporate memoranda, various financial and engineering reports. This was the office of an exceedingly busy and brilliant stallion. Delta grumbled to herself. Seems like he actually does some work after all. She pulled Jet's heavy office chair away from the richly styled oak desk, hopping up onto it without even thinking to ask permission and pulling herself up to her ex's work table. Again, not hesitating for even a moment to consider that she might be viewing some very private material. Delta snooped with glee, immediately catching her eye resting in the center of the blotter, seeming as if it hadn't been moved in a long time. It was a very familiar set of design blueprints for their spaceplane. And next to it comprised of fading yellowed paper, a thick-bound document with a very familiar title. Jet let out a muffled no, right into his daughter's musky plot just as Delta walked into his office. The little yelp was completely blocked off by his daughter's sweet flanks, who quickly flitted away from his flustered, flabbergasted face as she tittered with only chirping giggles, having just pranked her dad. He looked up with annoyance at the floating little teenage filly who had been in his head all morning and who had now just prevented him from stopping his ex from potentially getting access to his private journal. He scowled at her, getting ready to scold her, but Apogee was just looking at him with a stuck-out tongue, her hips waving back and forth and his face sultrily as she gave him yet another naughty smile. Jet had had enough. This little filly had been teasing him all morning, all day, all weekend. Because of her, his cock was aching and drooling, leaving splatters of pre-cum all along the wooden floor throughout the house, and dribbling a set of damp splotches on his library carpet, all because he was stuck staring at that sexy little rear. And he had gotten caught up in the damn rhythm. He had been unable to break away from her playful and risky behaviors. That filly, she'd been in total control all along, but not anymore. Jet reached up and grabbed his daughter by the athletic flanks, pulling her down by her butt, slamming her forcefully against the chest-high library table in the center of the room, making the books at the table jump. "Dad?" Apogee whispered, the wind partially knocking off from her lungs. But Jet wasn't going to wait. He pushed her onto the table, grabbing her thighs forcibly and spreading them, then dove drooling muzzle deep in her hot, steamy teenage filly snatch. Apogee's wings spread painfully wide with arousal and shock as she gripped the table's edge with her forehooves, trying to steady herself. Wasting no time, her father's tongue drew itself lazily along her swollen, juicy lips, then jumped up, running roughly over her little engorged clit, before tracing the inner folds of her slit until the muscular, lashing tongue reached the top of her snatch, running up and over the junction and going on to trace around the quivering tailhole and over her sweaty dock. Apogee's little love bud winked happily as her dad brought himself back down for another pass, this time spending more attention on her little nub of flesh, his tongue wrapping around it, caressing it, wrapping it with his fleshy, muscular pink blanket, before leaning in with little kisses to suckle and blow on his daughter's sensitive love button. She began to squirm, her hooves sliding on the polished wooden tabletop as her body shook with pleasure of her father's lavish oral attention. She squeaked lightly with each lick and suckle, her body twisting and grinding against itself internally, her hot swollen glands releasing copious amounts of fluid that spilled over her father's muzzle, begging him to continue, and all while her mother was just in the other room. Apogee shuddered in fear and pleasure as she remembered the risk she was taking. Thinking quickly, she reached lazily for one of the books on the table, bringing it to her mouth and biting down hard. And just in time too, as she clenched her teeth in lustful agony, a wave of feeling rushed through her from down below, a building warmth stemming out of the hot furnace of her nethers, which exploded upwards, cascading throughout her body, eventually becoming a stifled groan in her throat, making her bite down even harder on her book, drool pouring from her mouth. The drool pouring from her mouth had nothing on the squirting volume of juice shooting from her filly hood, though. Jet had to pull back as squirt after squirt was sprayed at him, each blast coinciding with a muscular winking convulsion as Apogee's rear humped violently against the library tabletop. The filly was pouring magically enhanced estrus juice everywhere, soaking her father's face and splashing down the library carpet below. Jet stepped back, admiring his teenage daughter's cute rear as she struggled to catch her breath. Apogee's mouth was still clenched down on the library book in her teeth, leaving a solid bite mark there. The filly continued to squirm and wiggle from the aftershocks of the latest climax, her eyes rolling lazily awash in a sea of pleasure and dopamine, swamping her neurological system. "So, I see you keep these thesis documents kicking around. Must be fun to gloat to yourself about how bad you screwed me over." Delta's voice carried from the other room. She seemed to be preoccupied entirely reviewing the documents he left in the open in his office. Still, how long could all those design diagrams and technical texts keep her attention? This shocking reminder of proximate danger should have been more than enough to kick Jet out of his lust-filled fugue he seemed to be trapped in. But with all the environmental variables, all the atmospheric turbulence of the zesper and estrus, the teasing, nothing would stop him now. "Nope," he groaned, his mind replying in total autopilot as he positioned his rigid stallionhood up against his teenager's filly's flanks. His thick sausage was wedged between her tight ass cheeks, the thicker than normal flesh squeezed by his daughter's tensing and twitching muscles as Jet slid himself up and down, his shaft trapped into her soaking, steaming plot. He could feel the underside of his cock being soaked by the sticky filly juice as he slid up between her buns, his sensitive and engorged flare running along her sticky honey pot and then over her tail hole, before finally sliding up against her dock and under the tail hairs as the thick hilt bumped against the bottom of her flat cheeks, his significant length placing his medial ridge resting against her red-hot ponnet. "Dad," Apogee started to moan out as the larger father hot-dogged his pipe against her plot, the force pressing her against the table before he reached forward and covered her mouth with his hoof, muffling her groans. "I can't have your mom getting suspicious," Jet whispered into Apogee's ear as he continued sliding his long girthy stallion hood through a slick valley of copious dollop of liquid, transparent pre-cum spurting from his flare through his daughter's tail hairs and into the lower back where each of his thrust forward. He nipped at her cute twitching ear. "At least not before I pounded your little fillyhood silly." Still covering his daughter's muzzle with his hoof, Jetstream repositioned his rear legs. He needed to take a sizable step back to adjust his hips to bring the Zesper-enhanced cock to its target. He heard through his hoof, his daughter's tongue tickling his frog as he moaned out. The feeling of her father's fat flare dragging across her tail hole and aligning itself with her winking open sex, igniting her passion further. Jetstream began to push forward. His daughter's teenage fillyhood was doing its best to accommodate his massive knob of a cockhead, but ultimately utterly failing. The soaked slick lips could only part painfully slowly. With his larger size, they were unable to simply permit him to glide into her depths easily. The pressure Jet was increasingly applying finally pushed Apogee's cute teenage rear against the tabletop, pinning her pussy between his hoof-sized cockhead and the unyielding wood of the table, pressing harder and harder. "Daddy, please," Apogee mumbled through her father's restraining hoof as her fillyhood strained to part itself wider to let Jet enter her twisting volcanic interior. Jet began short, violent thrusts with his hips, forcing his cock bit by bit into his daughter, stuffing her teenage pussy. His impatience was finally getting the better of him, as he felt his daughter's breath coming hot and heavy against his groan muffling out, as she grunted with resistance against the exertion of his pushes. "Damn, since when were you so tight?" Jet growled, taking his free hoof and grasping his daughter's dock, yanking it up and using it like a pommel to leverage himself into her unyielding teenage fillyhood with as much force as he could muster. And then it happened, amazingly slowly. His daughter's tight, strained, swollen lips parted around the top of his engorged mushroom, barely making it around his knobby, rigid flare. Jet felt his daughter stiffen up just as the moment her fillyhood finally yielded, her back tensing and bowing as a nervous spasm racked her, her wings flicking out and trembling. Her dad was huge. Jet felt his daughter's clenching fillyhood tensing and relaxing around his fat invading organ, the spasm sending incredible pleasure sensations through his shaft and deep into his gut, making sparks dance through his eyes in the orgasmic pops of sensation. But he could also feel his little filly pulling away from his girth slightly. He wasn't hurting her, but it was definitely uncomfortable for her to accommodate him. "You're an ass, you know that?" Delta V's voice came from the other room. Jet's heart thumped for a moment before he realized she was commenting about something she was reading, not on how callously he was breaking their daughter. Still, it seemed appropriate at this moment. Jet gave one more shove, causing a naughty squelch sound to escape his daughter's fillyhood as he finally slid a quarter of the way into her, making her squeak out in shock. With part of his massive cock finally wrapped in her clenching and writhing hot filly flesh, Jet slowly his incessant thrusts, letting his daughter adjust to the new size filling her, allowing her tight filly snatch muscles to relax around him, to mold themselves to his larger shape. "Sorry," Jet groaned, partially to Delta and partially to Apogee, still whimpering slightly beneath him. But it wasn't long before instinct-enhanced effects of Zesper roared back into the equation, the magical stimulation flooding Apogee's senses and turning her slight discomfort, taking her father's massive shaft into near-orgasmic highs of pleasure. Jet felt his little filly begin to melt around his cock, tension releasing from the clenched rows of muscles in her back, juices starting to flood again from the teenage pussy, the copious fillyhood trickling down the underside of his throbbing shaft, her liquid estrus trickling off of his testicles to the carpeted floor below. Apogee groaned, her head still spinning. The latest kick of Zesper stimulant was making her tongue loll out of her mouth as she overloaded on the magical and neurochemical stimulations pulling through her. The incredible fullness she felt in her lower body, the shifting of her muscles and organs to permit a huge stallionhood to enter her. It was all sending incredible feelings of pleasure racing through her body. She wanted, no, needed more. The filly began to wiggle her butt left and right in little needy motions, pushing back against her father's unmoving granite mountain of a cock. Her muscles were on fire, her body leaking filly juice, her head awash with hormonal and medicinal dopamine. But she was grinning goofily, her tail wagging the seductive happiness as she pushed back with her forehooves against her father, grinding her ass backwards, trying to get more stallion inside of her. "Come on, Dad, please," she whispered breathily, still worried about alerting her mother in the other room. Jetstream needed no further prompting. He was never good at denying his little filly what she wanted, and now would certainly be no exception. He placed his hooves on either side of his filly's athletic flanks, gripping her firmly about her hips to get a good hold on her. Her hooves were completely suspended off her tall library table. He didn't want to send the sliding across into a stack of books piled on the other end. With his hooves firmly anchored in the tight hip flesh of his daughter, Jetstream did what came naturally to all stallion studs inside hot estrus-laden fillies since time immemorial. He thrusted. Apogee buried her muzzle against the table as her father drove more of his length into her, her squeak softly dissipating into the warm oak of the tabletop as more and more stallionhood entered her, spreading the depths of her tight and twisting interior as it forced her immature teenage vaginal canal to stretch and part. The feel was no longer unpleasant or uncomfortable, though. It was amazing. Jet bit down on his lip to stifle his groans as he slipped another thick inch of stallion flesh into his daughter. His huge, fat meteor ring was finally pressing up against Apogee's grasping, quivering lips, preventing him from slipping more into her impossible girth into the vice-like velvet tunnel. The effects of Zesper on the middle-aged stud was incredible, though. He could feel her grasping, massaging, milking muscles, squeezing and caressing every part of his deeply embedded stallionhood. The little girl under him, who'd called him dad for so many years, that he'd taken to swim meets, shown how to fly for the first time, taken her to her first day of school, was now grinding herself against his cock, and he bucked her harder than he bucked Las Pegasus call girls. Jetstream couldn't help himself. He snorted a huge puff of air from the stalliony nostrils and began to work his length back and forth inside of his daughter, withdrawing with agonizing slowness as Apogee Snatch did its utmost to clench onto him and refuse him exit, and then Jet would reverse course, pushing forward again to elicit a sloppy, squelching drizzle from the filly juice, shivering with pleasure as he returned the inch he'd just withdrawn back into his little girl's drooling honeypot. The squelching sounds were growing louder, making Jet look nervously at the French doors of his study where Delta was currently sitting, obliviously. He couldn't see from his filly-mounted position, but he knew that if Delta decided to walk back into the library, there wouldn't be enough time for him to withdraw his steaming stallionhood from his filly and conceal their debauched sexual activity. She would find out, he would be ruined, and he didn't care one bit. If anything, the Zesper was making the unnecessary risk drive him even more wild, spurring him to ignore the terrifying reality he found himself in, only moments from total ruin, making him use the fear as motivation to pound his teenage filly's plot harder. In and out, in and out. The regular slow pace of Jet's heavy thrust caused his balls to swing slowly back and forth as he loosened Apogee's powerfully pussy grip, slowly but surely. The copious slick fluids of their union lubricated more and more length as he pistoned in and out of his little filly, her hooves grasping meekly at the table, trying to hold on as her father rutted her into oblivion. Each time Jet would withdraw, he would drag Apogee back with him into the suction of her snatch, forcing her to brace herself by holding onto the table. Then he would slowly push back into her, her mewling sigh only ending once he reached the limits of his return stroke, his medial ring. It continued this way for a few strokes until Jet felt something building, yearning in his balls, a familiar ache that began to assert itself insistently, urging him to abandon his considered pace, to buck wildly, to explode with lust into this girl. Apogee, he moaned into his daughter's ear as the cascade of instinctive demand continued to crash down in his mind, collapsing his resolve to resist. Daddy, Apogee moaned into the oak, her face twisting from left to right as she thrashed in pleasure, trying to keep her moans directed into the wood to stifle them. The pressure inside her snatch, the flattering and hardening was incredible. She could feel the bulge of her father's massive cockhead pressing through her lower belly to the table below as it engorged further with blood. But for Jet, it was now too late. The crescendo had already reached the point of no return, as Jet delivered the instinctive final thrust demanded by evolution, burying himself as deep as he could in filly-puss before his loins released their hot load, the boiling heat racing up through his sexual plumbing and up his twitching shaft almost painfully, the pressure gushing and bulging his shaft outward from the powerful ejaculatory pulse. Apogee. Jet bit into Apogee's neck, his moan becoming a grunt, as the seed erupted out of his flare, a hot, messy burst of thick splatter rushing from him, and thick ropes of sticky semen painting the insides of his little fillies with line after line of white, passionate butter. Spurt, spurt, spurt. Apogee buried her face painfully against the table, biting her tongue to prevent from crying out as her body reacted to the indescribable orgasmic bliss at the long-awaited presence of her father's stallion fluid. The prolactins, the testosterone in his semen, were absorbed by a sponge by their clenching needy filly walls, setting off fireworks in her nethers that spread like a warm wildfire, racing up the sides of her barrel and all the way up to the tips of her ears. Spurt, spurt, spurt. Jed released rope after rope, his cock bucking up and down with each powerful spray, hopping wildly in his daughter's snatch as it unloaded. Like cupping thrusts from Jet's strong hips continued to instinctively work, driving his shaft in and out ever so slightly, his motions meeting the gentle milking clenches of his little filly's needy cunt. Spurt, 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 splorch. Apogee felt her estrus convulsing, quivering, dripping into its opening, down in each milking grasp of her inner muscles to bathe her cervix in her father's batter, slapping the portal between her wings against the supporting cock slit with little kisses as her climax continued to rack her body. She began to feel the thick semen squelch noisily from her filly lips, joined by her father's shaft splattering the table below. She had been filled. Spurt, splorch, spurt, splorch, spurt, splorch. Jetstream moaned into his daughter's neck. He could feel the heavy dollops of streaming cum shooting from between his daughter's lower lips and his throbbing stallion hood, and he knew that he had much more left to fire. Just like earlier on the kitchen countertop, he seemed to be unstoppable, releasing more seed than he ever had in his entire life before this morning that was. Jet thought of his groaning, happy daughter underneath her wiggling, milking convulsions demanding even more from him. Even though he had given everything, he thought about her smiling face, the boundless enthusiasm and energy with which she attacked everything, the way that she turned to him and as a filly for help when she felt lost. How she would snuggle up to him when he'd fallen asleep exhausted after a long day of work on their couch. How as a younger filly she'd run up to him, teary-eyed when she'd hurt herself, asking for a bandage or a kiss to make the boo-boo feel better. And here he was now, mounting her, rutting her, defiling her most secret inner sanctum. He had fully claimed her, but he wanted more. His tongue stuck out as his stallion instincts took over. He wanted to mark her, to let everyone know that he was his filly. He pulled back, still shooting thick lines of semen, his massive engorged flare acting like a thick plug as he withdrew, spreading apogee wide and dredging unspeakable amounts of their combined juices out. And the nasty squelch accompanied the exit of Jet's cockhead, making apogee wriggle with discomfort as the pair finally disconnected with a pop, leaving her gaping, steaming pussy quivering and clenching, begging for his return. Spurt, spurt. Jet wasn't driving back in though. He was marking this filly for his use. He slapped his thick meat up onto her flanks, his fat flare perched over his prone filly, the heavy ropes of still spurting semen slinging out over her back, splattering along her spine and outstretched wings, the thick clear paint slinging out, and the manted heavy bursts of juice, just like earlier in the morning, only now he wasn't slathering his kitchen counter. It was his daughter. She was his. Jet aimed his larger, longer stallion hood slightly up, sending arcs of his spurting seed all the way into the back of Apogee's sweaty mane, strands of sticky white splattering against her neck, her ears, as if he were sloppily painting with a clear white gel. Jet pulled back, using his hoof to direct his bucking cock at Apogee's flanks, firing more ropes over her quivering butt cheeks and against her sloppy, drooling plot. A few final bursts trickled from his cock slit, leaving messy trails that connected his flare to Apogee's still. The bubbles of cum slid from his flare and drooled down his shaft. He'd done it. He'd claimed her. And he stood there for a moment, panting, looking at the absolute disaster of fluid that he had wrought on his daughter, her heaving, panting barrel resting on the messy tabletop. He exhaled a powerful snort through his nostrils. He felt like nickering, but the last vestige of sanity that held on to prevented him from doing so and revealing his deeds to Delta, still reading in the other room. Still, he couldn't help but puff up his chest, his erect penis still rigidly bouncing under his barrel, proud that he had bred his little mare so completely. And then Apogee lifted her head and looked back at him. Her eyes were aswim, her cute little muzzle hanging slightly open as her tongue darted in and out of her panting breasts. She seemed to be unable to focus on anything for a few moments. She was still trying to understand what the hell had just happened. And then their eyes met. And slowly understand dawned on his face as she read her father's wild stallion-like attitude in his features. And then she grinned, her eyebrows danced challengingly. She was a wild, untamed filly. He hadn't broken her yet. He'd changed that. And with a mighty flap of his wings, Jet lifted himself onto the library table, positioning himself directly over his daughter, his hips aligned with her sopping rump. With a little bit of excited fear, Apogee clambered forward as if trying to escape from her father, but he wasn't going to let her. Aligning his thick, hanging cock, he placed the drooling shiny head against her flanks and pushed down. Apogee's loosened, sloppy lips permitted his entrance immediately. The filly hood slid effortlessly over his cum-covered flare, her slick lips slopping over his flesh like a pink glove. Jetstream continued to jackhammer down into Apogee's butt, pinned against the unyielding tabletop even as she continued to scoot forward as if trying to escape. He'd stop that little game right now. He reached down and gripped her shoulders with his forehooves as she thrashed playfully under him, and then he let his full weight into his shaft. He immediately sank a few thick inches into her with a squelching thrust, driving himself all the way to his medial ring again, bulging Apogee's little belly once more. Apogee squeaked out, kicking in all directions with her legs. Her forehooves were now in reach of the books on the other end of the table, and knocked down a pile of them, making the clatter noisily to the floor. Both froze immediately, looking silent at the French doors of the study. Would this be the end? "Everything okay there, kid?" Jetstream chuckled to himself. Now it was his turn to live dangerously. His turn to tease Apogee. He began to add more and more weight on his shaft, pressing with all of his bulk against his daughter's yielding lips, which strained and strained, trying to part to let the massive cock base in. "Everything's fine, Mom," Apogee squeaked. Apogee squeaked out just as her lips finally slipped around her father's ring, the fat black cock sliding into her, pressing the huge cockhead against her uterus, even as her lips stretched the swollen folds, straining as they approached the fat, monstrous base of his girthy shaft. She had never felt so full before. Yesterday had already been incredible. This was something else, otherworldly. Her whole body seemed to be adapting, changing itself to permit the massive stallionhood into her. It wasn't just her clenching walls, her tensing muscles, her shifting internal organs. It was her very spirit. She felt like her father's cock belonged in her, the size dominating her, filling her, completing her. And then Jet began to move. Slowly at first, withdrawing by merely standing up with his legs. Taking his weight off the filly, the impossibly thick, black, veiny shaft inched out of her. And then he would reverse, adding his weight back, bending his knees and sinking the nasty-sounding splorches into the spasming fillyhood. Faster now, finding a rhythm and straining and relaxing, of rising and sinking each cycle, lifting his daughter slightly from the tabletop before driving her back against it, each time sinking a little deeper, plumbing her depths and claiming every part of her. Then with some violence and jackhammering bounding began, books hopping up and down on the table with each thumping drive. A small part of Jet's mind screamed at him to stop, to slow down. There was no way that they wouldn't be able to hear Delta like this, but the tiny internal voice was quickly dwarfed by the overwhelming flood of the lust-filled neurochemicals surging through him. It seemed to be going for Apogee as books clattered around her, falling to the carpeted floor below their perch on the tabletop. She began moaning again, her breathless pants no longer restrained by biting into a book and being muffled by the wood of the tabletop. Buck me," she groaned, her words punctuated with each jackhammering thrust, and Jetstream was happy to oblige. He let out a roar that filled the library, his wings spreading wide as he asserted himself, his muscles straining and sweating in the effort as he pounded his filly snatch with all the effort he could muster. "Dad, too big," Apogee shouted, finally feeling her father hit his new stallionhood in her, his hips finally slapping against hers at the never-ending powerful thrusts. The table tipped wildly, jumping along the carpeted floor as her father-daughter duo sweated and groaned, pistoning their bodies and squirting juices with reckless abandon. And then it gave way. Jet wrapped his arms around his daughter, tucking his shoulder and giving a mighty flap of his wings as they tumbled through the library, into the office, splinters of wood, table legs breaking, flying around like the shrapnel from a loud lust bomb. Apogee twisted about, trying to grab her father's barrel, the adrenaline of the sudden fall momentarily overshadowed by the uncomfortable feeling of such a large organ twisting around inside of her, moving everything in all different directions. The filly would be lying if she said the excitement didn't rush through her as well. The suddenness of the fall combined with the comforting safety she found in her father's grasp made the filly muscles clench and milk the stallionhood inside her with small, grasping convulsions. The pair finally slid to a halt in the middle of the office, Apogee having twisted to face her father so that they were now belly to belly. Jet didn't hesitate. He didn't even care the balcony door was open, that Delta had just flittered away moments earlier, before he began to grind in and out of his little filly again, making her throw her head back and groan. "Dad, please," she begged. It was enough. Jet felt his flare flatten once again, even though he'd completed his orgasm just moments before. But he grinned to himself. This filly was going to be a challenge to tame. He almost chuckled, even though the blissful tightness of his abdominal muscles began to overwhelm him. His orgasm mere moments away. She was greedy, the little filly after all. "Dad, yes." Apogee reached up with her rear hooves, wrapping her father's hips to keep him hilted deep within her as he erupted, pulling him against her with a leg and keeping him locked against her, buried in her. The fattened flare had embedded itself deep in Apogee's love canal, wedging itself in a position against her swollen cervix, perfectly positioned to flood her uterus. And flood it did, pump after pump, no longer splattering into Apogee's vagina to trickle out and be wasted on the tabletop. Now he was filling his daughter's womb with his potent seed. Jet's testicles raised and twitched in time with his pumping pulses, thick load after thick load filling into his daughter. He leaned in with his nose, nuzzling her head as she wrapped her forearms around his neck tightly, hanging on to ensure that she wouldn't get displaced, wouldn't lose any drop of her father's batter. "Yes, Dad." Apogee groaned coaxingly as her body milked his stallionhood, her belly expanding as her father dumped his magically enhanced volume of stallion milk into her. A few more pumps and Apogee felt herself passing out, fully satisfied. Her legs slipped from the death grip of a hip lock, thudding lightly as they fell to the office's floor. Her forearms unclasped her father's neck as she lowered herself, letting her head rest on its side as her eyes fluttered closed, her pants still coming in time with his thick, filling pump of stallion essence from her dad. Jetstream grinned. He'd won this round. As soon as Apogee had finally fully relaxed, melted away into blissful euphoria, he stood up, withdrawing himself from her body. Spurt, spurt, spurt. Still spurting, he let his black veined bouncing flesh unload rope after rope out over his filly's cute furry belly, thick white cream strands landing on the fluff of her adorable heaving chest, trailing down her pert teats before a new strand would fly out, splattering across her muzzle and neck. Spurt, spurt, spurt. He directed his shaft with his hoof, his lewd spray gun, aiming for parts of her fur and feathers that seemed untouched. He would claim her, mark her, own her in its entirety. He was her stud, and he'd make sure every pony knew it. Spurt, spurt. And once again he felt the force of his ejaculations relent, the throbbing swollen ache in his testicles relieving themselves as a wash of post-ejaculatory pleasure crashed through him. And then he came to his senses. What the buck did I just do? Jet stared down at his cum-covered filly, softly breathing despite the sloppy mess he had just made of her, as he had lewdly painted her with his stallion juice. Jet knew he'd crossed a line. He'd just purposely come all over his girl, tried to defile her to make her his little sex filly. He hadn't given a damn about how she felt, and he loved it. He dipped his head to the panting, tired face, the concern on his features rapidly apparent as his stallion had deflated rapidly. What had he just done to G? To his little hun, to his little girl. He felt tears building up within him, and then shut them quickly, trying to blink away the hot trickle forming in the corners of his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he tried to imagine the worst, the monstrous consequences of his domination. And then he felt it, a little wet touch on his nose, and he opened his eyes and he saw his little girl Apogee, though she was covered in his batter, with the most satisfied smile on her face, before she leaned forward one more time and laid another loving lick across his muzzle, a silent and cute thank you for what they just completed. It clicked then. Jetstream realized he loved this little filly, that he would do anything for her, damn the consequences, just as he always had. To be able to see her happy like this, satisfied, if this was what she wanted, this was what she would get. Thanks, Apogee. Jetstream managed to choke out. Apogee reached up with her hoof, booping her father on the nose. Thanks yourself, Dad. That was amazing. Could we do it again? Jetstream finished the question with a little eyebrow waggle. Tell you what, hun, I'll make you a deal. One time only, okay? Apogee nodded happily, her smile getting wider as the kid in her knew that this was the inevitable phraseology that came just before she'd get everything she wanted. Just until your heat is done, until your estrus clears. Jet blushed and looked up at the ceiling. I'm yours. Anything you want. Abachi squealed, shaking with excitement before lifting her back off the floor to wrap her father's neck in an excited hug. "Thanks, Dad." Jetstream sighed even as he felt his nethers begin to stiffen again. He had a feeling he was in for a hell of a night. Abachi broke her hug for a moment and arched an eyebrow, confusion on her face. Wait, where did Mom go? A few minutes earlier, Delta had just spotted an unusual document, something she hadn't expected to see here of all places. A faded yellow, thick-bound set of design documents. Design thesis for the reusable SSTO spaceplane by Jetstream and Delta V. She held a hoof to her chin in wonder. It was the original thesis paper that she had written some 16 years ago. To be fair, Jet's name was on it too, but Jet had only done the work around commercial aspects of reusable technology. The cost break-evens of various materials and fuels, the easy stuff. Well, she did have to admit he had also contributed some brilliant work in designing the aerofoils that would work as equally well at low speeds as they would at high atmosphere hypersonic velocities. Still, she'd been the one to do the important work, the engine design, the fuel turbo pumps, the rocket stack, the rocket nozzle design. Hey, the air-breathing ramjet engines she'd envisioned alone had kick-started a whole new generation of jet engine technology, which had propelled Jetstream to the head of a multi-billion-bit airline corporation. Delta's breath left her the moment she touched the faded documents reverently. She hadn't seen this in, well, forever. Did Jet keep this out on his desk just to remind himself that he'd taken everything from her? Delta felt her face begin to twist up in a growl of anger. "So I see you kept the thesis documents kicking around. Must be fun to gloat to yourself about how bad you screwed me over," Delta called out over her shoulder in the library behind her. "Nope," Jet mumbled out in the other room. Delta harumphed, ignoring him, flipping open the thesis. She was struck with an unwanted upswell of emotions as she immediately recognized the familiar hoof-writing style of a much younger Delta, who had penned the foreword in font for so many years. "Represents years of work during our time at Columbia University. Jet and I would like to thank the school and all of the faculty for their incredible support. Jet and I are both filled with hope for a beautiful future when our reusable spaceplanes convey our warm love, the love of Equestria. The stars. Delta V." Delta sniffled a little bit, the feeling her eyes got a bit misty as her emotions rose within her. That poor kid had no idea what was waiting for her. She was still so full of hope and purpose. A frown crossed her face as she shouted over her shoulder again, "You're an ass, you know that," before she turned the pages of the thesis to access more of the old text. A squeak from Apogee peeped out from her, probably a bit shocked at her sudden profanity. Delta mused, and then she heard Jet say, "Sorry." Delta snored. She didn't want this half-assed apology more than 16 years later. She felt her rage building as she flipped through the familiar text, the old diagrams, the technical tables that she'd slaved to create, before she began to be annoyed by all the notes in the margins, notes she didn't remember even writing. She tried to decipher the spidery handwriting, which was now recognized as clearly belonged to Jetstream, and finally she was able to understand one particular note dated 10 years earlier. Can't figure out what DV meant with this bypass valve system. It's obviously important, but it's really heavy. I asked the engineering guys at the company, and they couldn't figure it out either. They told me to get back to designing jetliners and leave the spaceplane stuff behind, but I can't. I can't let our dream die, let DV's old dream die. I was going to ask Delta about what this meant yesterday, at Apogee's first swim meet, but she didn't show up, probably getting wasted somewhere. Because of me. I hope she's okay. If those idiots couldn't even understand a simple air-driven coolant-fueled bypass, then they didn't deserve to be engineers. Why should she have to hold their hooves all the time? Delta flipped to another page, and another note in the margin she could read, this one from a couple of years ago. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Once again, I'm beside myself with how clever DV was. I think that's what always drew me to her. It was like a gravity well. Her incredible intelligence, I mean. Look at the variable inlet design. and it self-adjusts based on the exhaust temperature for optimum efficiency. But in reality, I think it was always Deevee's heart at the center of that gravity as well. Some days I miss her, the old Deevee. Apogee was almost brought to tears when Delta didn't even bother to going to the school play. Gavel told me later that she'd been incarcerated for her drunk and disorderly behavior. I wish I could help her, but I just make things worse. I'm sorry, Deevee. I'm sorry, Delta. Delta blinked, feeling tears forming in her eyes. Why did Jet refer to her separately as Deevee and Delta? She heard a clatter of books fall from the library table behind her and then stifled a moan from Apogee. Everything okay there, kid? She asked, looking back at the open doors, but unable to see anything from this angle. Had the kid taken a spill or something? Everything's fine, Mom. Apogee squeaked. Delta shrugged and turned back to the thesis, flipping to one last page which seemed to be covered in red ink from the notes in the margin which scribbled messily along the entire page. She took her time reading through the original text, a boring piece about minimizing lateral vibrations during the transition from air-breathing engines to rocket-powered exhaust thrust, before turning her attention to the sloppily handwritten note in red ink. It wasn't dated. I hate Delta. I had to pick up Apogee today from the junkyard, and she was inconsolable. She ran to her bedroom and cried for hours. I don't know what the mayor told her, but if it's anything like the venom she spits at me, she probably told our daughter that she was the worst mistake of her life, or something equally vicious. I'd held out hope after all these years that Deevee's good heart would come back to us, to me. But we end up with the booze-saturated, withered, blackened husk of a heart that Delta has cultivated. I've written in these margins for years, lying to myself that it's only because I needed a better understanding of the original design of our dream. But the reality is that I've been haunted by Deevee, haunted by her transformation into Delta. A transformation that was my fault. Every time I think about the company I built, about the connections I've made, the wealth I've accumulated, I know deep down that it's all just a shield, a second-place prize. I wanted Deevee to be with me during all of those moments. I wanted her to be there, smiling, dreaming, looking up at the stars by my side. I was such an ass all those 3 years ago. I loved Deevee. I still love her. I started all of these notes to try and banish her from my desires, to stop me from feeling down when I'd wake up for another callmare next to me that wasn't Deevee. And it became this diary of me remembering the good times and the bad. It's gotta stop. The hope I held out for Delta is fading fast, and if orbital mechanics have taught me anything, it's that we need to jettison dead weight if we'll have any chance to make it to our target altitude. I don't mind being weighed down, since I was responsible. What she's doing to Apogee is inexcusable. I don't know if I'm going to write any more notes. I think I may be done. But still, I love Deevee. I miss her, and because I know she's still there somewhere, I guess I love Delta too. That last word, too, became a blurry mess of splotched red as a drop of liquid fell onto it. Delta looked up surprised, expecting to see a leaking ceiling, only to find nothing there. She reached a hoof up to her face, touching it lightly and feeling dampness there. She was crying. This sucked. Delta pushed away from the desk shakily, reaching for a pack of cigarettes with one hoof, and the other tried to rub her crying eyes clear, but her shaking form was having trouble extracting a pack, and she gave up and brought her hoof down with a frustrated slam on the desktop. What the hell was with all that Deevee and Delta crap? She was Deevee. He was the asshole who'd made her Delta. Wait, there was nothing wrong with being Delta, was there? Delta took in a choking half-sob of breath, tears running freely down her cheeks now. Screw this. Screw having to come to this stupid apartment. Screw trying to be a mom and a better pony. She needed a drink. Delta snatched the thesis documents and opened the sliding glass door balcony. I'm out of here. I'm late for an appointment with a bartender. Delta called out over her shoulder as she stomped out of the balcony. Take care of yourself, kid. Jet. And she flew off, just like that. What a climactic ending. Holy smokes, Batman. Ladies and gentlemen, hold on. Let's get an official count here. We're having a nice long talk after what the hell I just put myself through. Any landing you can walk away from. Chapter 3, 18,758 words. About a father-daughter incest relationship, which seems interesting, but it's got this underlying theme, this underlying all-too-real feeling relationship. You know? It's incredibly common these days for divorced parents and kids. I'm one of them. This story speaks to me very, very clearly. I can relate very easily with the troubles that these two parents are going through. Not in like a direct manner, like I'm married or something, but what I've witnessed from my own parents, from my own relationship with my parents. I don't wish that stress upon anyone in the world, but it's an unfortunate reality these days. But what do I know? I'm no philosophy channel, I just read porn on the internet. And I hope you guys have had a wunderbar day. This one deserves a peace off.